April 8, 1943. At an altitude of nearly 27,000 feet above occupied France, the sky was calm, crystalline, and unforgiving. Inside the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 198.5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican surveyed the scene below through the clear canopy. His oxygen mask concealed most of his face, but not the unmistakable curve of a confident smirk. Rising slowly beneath his formation were unfamiliar, shapes large, bulky aircraft climbing with visible effort toward the waiting German fighters. Hermican was 26 years old, a seasoned ace of Jagdish, hardened by years of uninterrupted combat across Europe. Poland, France, Britain, Russia, he had seen them all. What he saw now struck him as absurd. "These must be flying milk bottles," he radioed to his wingman, laughter breaking through the transmission. Below, 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the U.S. 4th Fighter Group struggled upward in tight formation. Their massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines thundered under full strain, each delivering 2,000 horsepower to lift an aircraft weighing nearly 7 tons into thin air. It was the American fighters' first combat appearance over occupied Europe. Two German pilots accustomed to lean Spitfires and agile their barrel-shaped fuselages were capped with greenhouse canopies. Their wings appeared undersized for such immense bodies. Their propellers seemed oversized even by Luftwaffe standards. Nothing about them suggested elegance or finesse. What Hermican and the circling German pilots could not know, what none of them could yet imagine, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would methodically dismantle the Luftwaffe fighter arm over the next 80 months. In time, those same milk bottles would become symbols of terror. Their 8 synchronized Browning machine guns would generate a sound that German pilots would come to dread above all others. The arithmetic of destruction was already embedded in their broad wings, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined firing rate approaching 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to tear a fighter apart in seconds. That transformation began on this April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, noticed the German formation maneuvering for attack. Blakesley was a veteran of the famed Eagle squadrons, having flown RAF Spitfires only weeks earlier. He understood something his pilots had yet to learn. Survival in the P-47 demanded abandoning everything they believed they knew about aerial combat. The Thunderbolt was not merely another fighter, it was a radical redefinition of what a fighter could be. While Germany had pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb rate and turning performance, Republic Aviation followed a completely different philosophy. They built an aircraft that relied on mass, brute power, and overwhelming firepower. It was an aerial juggernaut designed to dominate high-altitude combat rather than dance within it. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the French sky that morning were men who would one day become legends. At that moment, however, they were novices flying an unproven machine against the most experienced fighter force on Earth. The Germans had been at war since 1939. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This is a story of how industrial logic overcame tactical brilliance, how quantity merged with quality to create unstoppable superiority, and how laughter in the German cockpits turned to fear once pilots learned what synchronized heavy machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. The monster is born. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born from panic. In June 1940, as German forces tore through France, Alexander Karcheveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent requirements from the U.S. Army Air Forces. They demanded a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best fighters. What Karcheveli delivered was something entirely unexpected. It will be a dinosaur. He admitted to his design team, but it will be a dinosaur with proper proportions. The prototype, designated Shispe-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941. It shocked everyone who saw it. Empty, it weighed nearly 9,900 pounds, over 60% heavier than its predecessor. The P-43 Lancer, a massive turbo-supercharger system, ran through the rear fuselage, fed by exhaust gases channeled through complex ducting. The result was an aircraft with an almost swollen appearance. Unlike anything previously flown, test pilots encountering it for the first time often ask the same question. Does this thing actually fly? It did more than fly, it excelled at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp was an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. With turbo-supercharging, it maintained full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters struggled for air, While conventional superchargers lost efficiency in thin air, the P-47 delivered near sea-level performance in the stratosphere, yet early impressions were not kind. Major Hubert Jabzemk, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during training in Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents alone. The Thunderbolt proved unforgiving ground, looping on landing, torque rolling on takeoff, and diving with such enthusiasm that pilots encountered compressibility, their controls stiffening as shockwaves formed along the wings. For months, the P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans in combat. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would later become one of America's top aces, described his first flight simply, "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly, itu aimed it." The first combat encounters of April and May 1943 appeared to confirm every German assumption. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could not outturn the Focke-Wulf 190. It could not outclimb the Messerschmitt Bf 109 at lower altitudes. In medium-height engagements, it felt heavy, slow to respond, and unforgiving of mistakes. Against experienced Luftwaffe pilots, these weaknesses were exposed quickly and ruthlessly. German fighter units adapted almost immediately. They attacked from below, where the Thunderbolt's weight worked against it. They forced turning engagements, exploiting agility over brute strength. When American pilots tried to fight the P-47 like a Spitfire, the results were predictable. After his first encounter, Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jägerjägerwater 26, reported confidently to headquarters. "The new American fighter is easy prey," he wrote. "It handles like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a heavily loaded transport. My pilots call them fat targets, pretending to be fighters." Early statistics seemed to support his confidence. During their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts while claiming only 3 confirmed German kills. Craft pilots observing from their Spitfire squadrons quietly questioned the American choice of aircraft. British humor was less restrained. One joke circulated that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unbuckle and run laps inside the cockpit. On paper, the Thunderbolt appeared to be a failure. Yet something unusual was happening in those early battles, something German intelligence did not notice. The P-47s that went down did not fall easily. Aircraft that returned to base often showed damage that would have destroyed any contemporary fighter. One Thunderbolt limped home on May 4th with over 20 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes. Its structure held, its engine kept running. Its pilot survived. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant lines, absorbed punishment that would have instantly disabled liquid-cooled fighters. Armor plating protected vital systems. The airframe itself was overbuilt far beyond normal fighter standards. More importantly, when a Thunderbolt did manage to bring its guns to bear, the results were devastating. Unlike early war fighters armed with rifle-caliber weapons, or cannon-equipped aircraft limited by ammunition capacity, the P-47 could sustain fire for over 30 seconds. In aerial combat, that was an eternity. Its 8 heavy machine guns created a dense convergence zonal wall of lead unlike anything German pilots had faced before. The turning point came on June 26, 1943, over northern France. The day a Thunderbolt refused to die. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was flying as part of a P-47 formation returning from escort duty. They were low on fuel, relaxed, and unprepared when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jägerjägerwater, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, executed a textbook attack. Diving from the sun with overwhelming speed, the German fighters tore into the formation. Johnson's Thunderbolts, positioned at the rear, was hit almost immediately. Cannon shells detonated across the aircraft. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling was ripped apart. Flames erupted behind the instrument panel. Shrapnel and bullet fragments wounded Johnson in the face and leg. He attempted to bail out, but the canopy would not move. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. At 27,000 feet, Johnson was trapped inside a dying aircraft. What followed defied every expectation of combat survivability. Blinded by oil covering the windscreen, flying with an engine that shook violently and controls that barely responded, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and turn toward England. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. The P-47 kept flying. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unidentified German pilot, spotted the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at barely 170 miles per hour. Closing in from behind, the German opened fire. Cannon shells struck the P-47 again and again. Johnson could do nothing but press himself against the armor plate and wait for the end. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load. When the cannon ran dry, the German pilot repositioned and fired his machine guns. Still, the American fighter flew. Pulling alongside, the Germans stared at the wrecked aircraft in disbelief. Johnson saw his face, clearly young, blonde, no longer confident. The German shook his head, gave a brief salute, and broke away, out of ammunition. Johnson's P-47 barely made it to main. The engine failed on landing. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after 200. 3 of the 4 main fuselage longerons were severed. Control cables were nearly cut through. A cannon shell had detonated inches from Johnson's head. Another had exploded against the armor behind his seat. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The story spread quickly in both sides of the front. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own design. German intelligence initially refused to believe the reports. No aircraft, they insisted, could absorb that much damage and remain airborne. But testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had survived everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to understand what they truly had. By mid-1943, American pilots were finally learning the Thunderbolt's language. The breakthrough did not come from manuals or theories, but from hard experience and loss. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemker, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, distilled the lesson into a simple rule set passed quietly from pilot to pilot. Do not turn with them. Do not climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your GANs. What had once been seen as the P-47's greatest weakness, its enormous mass became its deadliest weapon. In a dive, nothing in the German inventory could match it. From above 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could accelerate beyond 550 miles per hour, faster than any Luftwaffe fighter could safely follow. German pilots attempting pursuit found their aircraft shaking violently as compressibility effects set in, forcing them to pull out or risk structural failure. The P-47, built like a battering ram, simply kept going. That speed could then be converted back into altitude. Thunderbolts would dive through German formations, fire, and then climb away in a zoom ascent that left their opponents powerless to respond. The Germans could neither follow nor counter. Captain Walker Bud Mahoran, one of the first American aces in Europe, refined the method into a disciplined doctrine. Officially, it became known as boom and zoom. Among pilots, it earned a darker nickname, the Thunderbolt Turkey Shoot. Rather than engaging in traditional dogfights, P-47 units climbed higher than German fighters could operate effectively, often above 30,000 feet. When enemy formations appeared below, the Americans rolled inverted and dived. The descent was terrifying. At such speeds, German deflection shooting became nearly impossible. By the time a pilot could line up a shot, the Thunderbolt was already past him, climbing again. But at the bottom of those dives, for a brief and lethal moment, the American guns spoke. What German pilots encountered was not individual gunfire, but a solid stream of lead. 8.5 O-caliber Browning machine guns fired simultaneously, their trajectories converging into a tight zone roughly the size of a small car. Anything caught in that space did not merely fall, it came appartamenti. Survivors described it as flying into a metal storm. The true revelation of American firepower arrived on August 17, 1943. During the massive dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. It was the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date and a test of every Allied escort fighter. For the P-47, the mission exposed both its limitation and its terror. Even with drop tanks, the Thunderbolt could not escort bombers all the way to the target and back. But while it remained with the formations, it demonstrated exactly what it could do when used correctly. Major David Schilling of the 62nd Fighter Squadron encountered a group of German Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyer aircraft positioning for attack. The twin-engine fighters were heavily armed with cannon and rockets designed specifically to rip apart bombers. Schilling's 4 Thunderbolts attacked from above. Rolling into a steep dive from 28,000 feet, they struck with overwhelming speed. A German rear gunner who survived the encounter later described it during interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from the sky. I opened fire at long range. I saw hits on the wing. The aircraft did not react, then it fired. The machine ahead of us simply ceased to exist. Not shot down. Not damaged. Destroyed. Wings separated. Fuselage broke apart. Crew compartment vanished into fragments. Within seconds, multiple German aircraft were annihilated. This was the reality of the Thunderbolt's armament. Each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition, 425 per gun, nearly 900 pounds of bullets, at standard convergence distances, often set between 250 and 300 yards. The combined fire delivered over 100 projectiles per second into a concentrated impact zone. German fighters, limited by cannon ammunition, often less than 200 rounds, total could not match that sustained output. American pilots could fire continuously for over half a minute without exhausting their supply. When they pressed the trigger, the result was overwhelming. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabriski, who would become the top American ace in Europe, described the effect with brutal clarity. When all 8 guns hit, the enemy doesn't go down. He explodes. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe discovered another cruel truth. The higher the fight climbed, the worse their situation became. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine maintained full power well above 30,000 feet. German fighters, dependent on mechanical superchargers, lost performance rapidly above 25,000 feet. Controls grew sluggish, climb rates collapsed, engines struggled for oxygen. Altitude, once a refuge, became a trap. On October 8, 1943, one of Germany's most accomplished pilots learned this firsthand. Leading a formation against American bombers near Bremen, he found his Focke-Wulf unresponsive in the thin air. When Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group descended from above 32,000 feet, there was no escape. American pilots attacked with cold precision, short bursts, controlled passes, no turning fights, no pursuit into danger. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under concentrated fire. No parachutes were observed. The loss sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If even its most experienced pilots could not survive encounters with the Thunderbolt at altitude, what chance did the rest have? German command ordered an immediate reassessment of the American fighter. The conclusions were deeply unsettling. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer dismissed the Thunderbolt. What had once been mocked as an overweight curiosity was now recognized as a dominant force above 20,000 feet. German intelligence reports, once confident, grew cautious, then urgent. The big American fighter was not merely surviving, it was evolving. The next step in that evolution arrived in England in early 19... The P-47D-22 introduced a seemingly simple modification that changed everything. A massive Hamilton standard paddle blade propeller, nearly 13 feet in diameter. Its broad blades bit into the air with authority, converting engine power into thrust far more efficiently than earlier designs. The effect was immediate. Climb rates improved dramatically. Acceleration increased. The Thunderbolt, once criticized for its sluggish ascent, could now meet German fighters on equal terms and, in some cases, exceed them. Where earlier models struggled to gain 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the new variants approached 3,000 feet per minute. At altitude, where the turbo-supercharger came into its own, the advantage widened further. Veteran German pilots noticed the change at once. During a February 1944 interception near Hanover, a seasoned Jagdgeschwader commander recorded his shock in a personal diary. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting the usual advantage. Instead, they turned toward us and rose with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed to 30,000 feet. One of ours was caught and destroyed. These are not the machines we laughed at last year. The new propeller altered more than performance, it changed the Thunderbolt's presence. As the blade tips approached supersonic speed, the aircraft produced a deep, rolling thunder that could be heard from miles away. German ground troops learned to recognize it instantly. The sound meant that American fighters were overhead, and that survival now depended on speed and cover. They gave it a name of their own, the Thunderclap. By March 1944, external fuel tanks extended the P-47's range deep into enemy territory. With 2 wing tanks or a belly tank attached, Thunderbolts could escort bombers more than 1,000 miles and still fight effectively after dropping their loads. The Luftwaffe's response was desperate. German pilots increasingly bypassed the escorts and attacked bombers directly, hoping to inflict enough damage to halt the American daylight offensive. But doing so meant flying through layers of Thunderbolts stacked at every altitude. Major Günther Rohl, one of Germany's most successful aces, survived such an encounter in March 1944. He later recalled, "We saw them above us, thick shapes against the sun. Someone joked that the flying pigs had arrived. No one was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 aircraft completely. Their guns did not fire in bursts, they poured fire. Survival increasingly depended on luck rather than skill. As spring approached, the Thunderbolt assumed a new role, one that would make it feared not just in the air, but on the ground. With long-range escort duties gradually shifting to the P-51 Mustang, P-47 units were reassigned to ground attack. It was here that the Thunderbolt revealed perhaps its most devastating capability. Its 8 heavy machine guns, already lethal in air combat, proved equally destructive against vehicles, railways, and troop concentrations. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the thinner top armor of tanks and ignite fuel trucks with ease. A 2-second burst delivered over 160 half-inch projectiles into an area the size of a truck. Then came bombs and rockets. Later, variants of the Thunderbolt could carry a payload rivaling that of early war medium bombers. 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and another beneath the fuselage. Rocket stubs allowed it to fire high-velocity rockets, each with the destructive power of an artillery shell. German ground units experienced these attacks firsthand during the Normandy campaign. One regimental commander later described the effect. "They came in so low we could see the pilots' faces. The engines roared. Rockets screamed. And then the hammering of machine guns began. A column of vehicles simply vanished. Trucks, men, equipment gone in seconds. It was not air attack. It was execution. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers learned that daylight movement invited destruction. Columns froze in place. Supplies halted. Command and control collapsed under constant aerial pressure. On June 6, 1944, the full extent of the shift in air power became undeniable. Over 500 P-47s patrolled the skies above the invasion beaches. They formed an unbroken shield from sea level to 30,000 feet. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were intercepted and destroyed in staggering numbers. One of the few German pilots to penetrate the area reported bluntly, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were everywhere. You could not climb over them. You could not dive beneath them. Their guns turned our aircraft into falling metal." In the weeks that followed, Thunderbolts systematically dismantled German mobility in daylight. Rail lines, bridges, convoys, and armored columns were hunted relentlessly. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, surrendering the initiative across the battlefield. By summer's end, the transformation was complete. The aircraft once dismissed as clumsy and absurd had become the backbone of Allied air power in Western Europe. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had one final hope. The Messerschmitt Mi-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, promised salvation. With a top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, it appeared untouchable by propeller-driven aircraft. German command believed it would restore balance to the skies. In theory, they were correct. In practice, the Thunderbolt found ways to kill jets. P-47 pilots quickly learned that speed alone did not guarantee survival. Jet engines were vulnerable during takeoff and landing when throttle response was slow and acceleration limited. They were also exposed during shallow turns and attack runs against bombers. From altitude, the Thunderbolt could still strike. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group proved the point. Diving from over 28,000 feet, his P-47 accelerated to nearly 500 miles per hour, fast enough to close on a Mi-262 in level flight. The jet pilot never saw the attack coming. Meyer opened fire at 400 yards. The concentrated fire of 8 heavy machine guns tore through the jet. Both engines separated. The aircraft disintegrated in mid. No escape was observed. The combat report was brief and unemotional. Enemy aircraft destroyed by sustained .50 caliber fire. It would not be the last such encounter. Specialized P-47 variants soon followed. The P-47M, equipped with water methanol injection, produced up to 2,800 horsepower and reached nearly 470 miles per hour at altitude. These aircraft were deployed specifically to counter jets and V-1 flying bombs. Major George Bostwick, commanding a Thunderbolt squadron in early 1945, summarized the reality. The jets are faster, but they cannot turn, and they cannot take punishment. One good burst, and they come apart. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched its last major offensive. Operation Bodenplatte was a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Nearly 900 German fighters participated, many flown by the last experienced pilots remaining. Initially, the attack succeeded. At several bases, Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, including dozens of Thunderbolts. At Y-34 airfield, German pilots taunted captured personnel, believing they had dealt a decisive blow. One American response became legendary. A German pilot pointed at the burning aircraft and asked, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking gestured toward the dispersal area, where ground crews were already clearing wreckage. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" Within 48 hours, factory-fresh Thunderbolts filled the flight line. The Luftwaffe paid an irrecoverable price. Over 200 German pilots were killed or captured, losses that could never be replaced. The aircraft could be rebuilt. The men could not. The balance was final. The Thunderbolt was more than a weapon. It was a product of industrial warfare on a scale Germany could not match. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. Achipi-Kauchipuchi, one aircraft left the factory every hour. Plants in New York and Indiana operated around the clock. Each Thunderbolt contained tens of thousands of individual parts, miles of wiring, and an engine more complex than anything Germany produced in quantity. Yet American factories delivered them faster than Germany could replace simple fighters. The same was true of ammunition. Each P-47 sortie consumed thousands of rounds. By mid-1944, American factories produced tens of millions of .50 caliber rounds every month. Each manufactured at precise tolerances to ensure reliability at altitude. Fuel flowed just as freely. While German pilots rationed training hours, American pilots arrived with hundreds of hours in their logbooks. They had practiced formation, flying gunnery, instrument navigation, and combat tactics extensively before ever seeing an enemy aircraft. The difference showed in the air. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages, grounded aircraft, airfields lay in ruins. Inexperienced pilots were sent into combat with minimal training against Thunderbolt formations controlling every altitude. Survival was measured in seconds. One of the last German pilots trained before the war ended later described his only combat mission. "I saw them diving from above 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, it was useless. The leader fired once. My aircraft shook like it was hit by hammers. The engine exploded. I escaped only by luck." Such encounters became routine. German medical officers even identified a condition they called fighter bomber shock, physical symptoms triggered by reports of Thunderbolts in the area. The sound alone caused panic among troops who knew what followed. The laughter of 1943 was gone. In its place remained fear. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Thunderbolt was still flying combat missions. It had outlasted its critics, it had outlived its rivals, and it had helped destroy an air force that once dominated the skies. The numbers alone tell part of the story. P-47 units flew more than 423,000 combat sorties in Europe. They destroyed over 4,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands more on the ground. They dropped more than 130,000 tons of bombs and fired hundreds of millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. But statistics do not explain why German pilots feared it. To understand that, one must look beyond performance charts. The Thunderbolt did not rely on finesse. It was not elegant. It was not delicate. It was a flying machine built on one brutal assumption. It would be hit-hand, it would keep flying. Pilots returned with cylinders shot away, wings torn open, control surfaces shredded, and engines leaking oil. Many of those aircraft would have been lost in any other design. The P-47 carried them home. German after-action reports repeatedly noted the same frustration. Enemy fighter absorbs heavy fire and continues combat. That sentence appeared again and again. Post-war interviews with former Luftwaffe pilots revealed a deeper truth. They did not fear the Thunderbolt because it was faster. They did not fear it because it turned better. They feared it because it removed their options. If they climbed, it followed. If they dove, it dove faster. If they fired, it absorbed the hits. If they were caught in its guns, there was no recovery. One former Focke-Wulf pilot summarized it simply: with a Mustang, you might escape if you flew well. With a Thunderbolt, escape depended on whether it missed. The P-47 forced combat on American terms. It dictated altitude. It dictated timing. And when it attacked, it attacked with overwhelming force. Yet the Thunderbolt's true strength was not just metal and horsepower, it was the system behind it. While Germany fought with diminishing resources, American industry expanded without restraint. Damaged aircraft were replaced, worn engine sims were swapped, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots flowed forward continuously. The Thunderbolt was designed to fit that reality. It was forgiving, it was durable, it was maintainable under combat conditions. Ground crews could service it quickly, pilots trusted it completely. That trust allowed them to fight aggressively, knowing the aircraft would not betray them. Air superiority is not achieved by a single perfect fighter. It is achieved when an enemy can no longer challenge the sky. By late 1944, that point had been reached. When jet aircraft replaced piston fighters after the war, the Thunderbolt faded from frontline service. Yet, its influence did not disappear. The philosophy it embodied, speed from altitude, concentrated firepower, survivability above all else, became standard doctrine in later air combat design. Today, historians no longer debate whether the P-47 was misunderstood. They recognize what it truly was, not a dogfighter, not a showpiece, but a weapon of air control. It did not win the air war alone, but without it, the air war in Europe would have been far longer and far bloodier. The laughter that greeted its arrival in 1942 was gone by 1945. In its place stood silence, broken only by the distant echo of thunder.